voter ecosystem and make every data action point that you have at the campaign level actionable. So please visit us at our booth. We have simulation technology that we can show you live and how to optimize your campaigns in real time to help you win. So thanks so much for your time and for your support, and have a great rest of the day.
Please welcome our next session, The Changing Landscape of News.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Margita Thompson, and while I'm currently in the private sector, I've gone civilian. I was previously press secretary for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. I worked on the media side. I was political producer for Larry King Live. And as we know, Governor Schwarzenegger is no longer in office. Larry King's no longer on the news. So there is an evolving landscape in terms of the constant churn of who's in elective office and what sort of outlets we can actually get our news out on. I'd like to, first of all, have all of the panel introduce themselves, and then we can go on to the program.
Hi, I'm Sarah Lee. I most recently was the communications strategist on the John Cox for Governor campaign here in California. But in the past, I did media relations for the California Chamber of Commerce, a lot of the business community. I was press secretary for Maria Shriver during the recall election here in California. And I've done a lot of work for a number of nonprofits, legislative battles, et cetera. So run the gamut.
I'm Jared Leopold. I guess I'm the token Democrat on the panel here today. I work for Governor Jay Inslee on his presidential campaign as a senior advisor. And before that, I was at the DGA for 4 years working on gubernatorial races. So you may hear a little bit about Florida here. I come from sort of a journalism background. I went to school for journalism, did an internship at what was then the St. Pete Times, and then branched off into political communications and have kind of run around the country on campaigns and really interested in the interplay between the newer media and the traditional media that I sort of came up in.
And I'm Brad Harold. I'm a vice president at Something Else Strategies. I was campaign manager for Ron DeSantis, now the governor of Florida. Last cycle came up in Florida politics.
Yes, he is the governor.
He is the governor. Despite what some on the Democrat side would say, Kevin Cate would still out there telling people that Gillum won. Before that, worked as the executive director for the Republican Party of Florida, had some other odd jobs in Florida, and now we focus at Something Else on political media. So.
Great. So for Flax, we could think about the fact that the changing landscape of news means that there's more opportunity for us to get a message out, or more platforms to have some of our messages and mistakes perhaps amplified as well. So Sarah, why don't we start off with talking about how you can keep up with how this media platforms are shifting and evolving.
Thanks, Margita. So as Margita said, there are so many more platforms now, and I had a unique perspective on this. I actually was out of the game for about 10 years raising kids. So when I left politics, there was no internet really. Maybe you'd have AOL and it would take an hour and a half to get one clip up on your screen. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, and then I came back after my kids were a little older in about 2015, and all of a sudden everything had exploded. I had to relearn, there's Twitter and Facebook and all these different things. And so while many people kind of grew up with all the different changes, I was slapped with it in the face when I started working again. So I think that it has presented, like Margita said, a huge host of options for how you get your message out, but also a huge host of options for mistakes by your candidate, by the campaign, by campaign staff, where you have young kids up on Twitter and saying different things. I also think it's really changed in that where you get your news. I think we all know in this room that you always have to look at the source, who wrote the article, but you have to look at what the voters see, and they don't know what Blogger is versus the New York Times, and often take that at face value. So it's been a real struggle, but it's something very interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, one of the things that I think is really interesting between when I started my career about 15 years ago and where we're at now is that this cycle has gotten faster and faster. And it used to be you were fighting for the story in the next day's paper, or you were fighting for how things looked on the evening news. Now you have sort of this drafting room of news stories that's happening on Twitter every moment. So when news breaks, you have to engage in that minute to make a difference in that minute, because that's what's going to shape the story the next day, or what's playing every hour on cable news.
No more 4 p.m. deadline for the next day.
No, it's got to be always on.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm the youngest one here. So, I mean, I remember, like, I have read about what clips are. Apparently, you cut them out of a newspaper. You had to paste them. We just do that with email now. It seems way easier. But I mean, it's. I think, like, when you're talking about the changing landscape of news, it's so segmented now, and so much stuff is not breaking through. I mean, probably what you were saying, like 15 years ago, you know, if the Tampa Bay Times called now the Tampa Bay Times, the St. Pete Times,
I've
called.
dated myself.
Yeah, you were scared. You were scared of the phone call, right? You were like, oh no, if this ends up on the front page of the St. Pete Times, that's it. Like, if a bad story ends up there, you're in real trouble. Now that stuff doesn't really matter. It's so hard to break through. The St. Pete Times is the biggest paper in Florida, and they have a partnership with the Miami Herald, but they have such low circulation compared to what you can do on your own through paid media and other, you know. We did I know Whit Ayers is here, who was our pollster for DeSantis. In the primary, when we did the poll about how our primary electorate in Florida was getting their news, like print TV or print newspapers were 5th on the list. I mean, it was nowhere close. And so I think, like, if we're still thinking about the old way of doing things, we're going to have real trouble. And with Marco, I know we did a study where Marco's press office was trying to figure out, like, why they were always so backlogged on stories. And they found out that they were spending 85% of their time responding to print newspapers, who were the most, you know, there's more of them, but the impact of that was so little that they just essentially stopped responding to the print newspapers and have started to focus on the things where they can actually push the ball, because Marco's Twitter feed gets to more people than the Tampa Bay Times now does.
So Jared, building on that, how have the rules of engagement shifted for earned media? What is earned media, and how do you decide what relationship you're going to have with the different reporters from those outlets?
Yeah, I think one thing that I noticed that's changed a lot is how you pitch stories has changed. You end up with, you know, getting a story placed in the Trump era about some vote that Ron DeSantis took in 2010. Well, I guess he wouldn't have taken 2012. Very difficult to get, because, like, if you're trying to compete with Donald Trump. So I think you need to, one of the things that I found is sometimes I would pitch a reporter to just tweet something. And that would be a win for me, because I would get it out in the ether. And 10 years ago, I never would have thought that would be something that would count as a win. But you get it out in the ether and people start piling on. And you have this whole ecosystem where the news is developed largely on Twitter, which is really, you know, it's not real people so much, but it's a small segment of people who are driving the news that a lot of people are seeing on their TV sets.
And reporters a lot operate on Twitter.
Yes.
I mean, that's interesting. That's what we did a lot on the Cox campaign. We had a great communications staff that had really strong relationships with reporters. And if there was a story, you know, we had a new ad run or something that wasn't big enough to get a reporter's attention, but we could get them to tweet about it, and then people would share it, and it would just kind of grow organically, that was a win. And that's different than what it used to be.
I mean, I think, like, we would spend, Florida is different than a lot of states, similar to California, obviously. It's very big. There are a ton of media markets. It's difficult to push a message, especially an earned media message. You know, the most shared earned media message in our campaign was a negative one on us, and we had to fight out from under that in the general election. But you know, the truth is getting these reporters and getting them to do things, you know, we view it as an opportunity for really two things. It's, if you think you're putting a story in the newspaper and all of a sudden a bunch of voters are going to have their minds changed because they read some story in the newspaper, it just doesn't work like that. So we view it as two things. One, if you can put the other campaign on their heels. If you can get a negative story placed, they spend a day trying to, you know, they didn't do their research on this, they didn't know, they were blindsided. They had to spend an entire day, their campaign was frozen, focused on researching that, trying to figure out how they're going to respond. You can get them off their game. And then the second thing is getting these stories placed so that we can put them in attack ads. You know, we want a negative story placed so that we have a third-party validator when we're putting things on television, or we're putting a story on mail or digital or text message, whatever it is. And I think that's where that's where the print side has been more useful. Is still the Tampa Bay Times has a very, if people see that on a mail piece that the Tampa Bay Times said this, it's a third-party validator in a way that if we just slapped it on a mail piece, it would be different. So I think those are the two ways that we still use kind of the print, Twitter, ecosphere, and Jared can laugh about it because they were very good at it in the primary. We spent a lot of days trying to go, God, we didn't really do our research on this one. Maybe we should figure out what that one's all about. And we wasted a lot of time responding to Jared.
It was more my minions than me, I guess, but I'll take credit. I think one other piece about that is I think there is still a gatekeeper function that traditional media are playing. We had one in Colorado, for example. There was a story that broke in conservative media. We were unable to stop it because it was the Washington Free Beacon. The story was false and basically took an incident that occurred to Jared Polis where he was a victim and made him into the perpetrator. But we managed to push back on that. It still wasn't ads, but we pushed back on it heavily with TV stations, with local papers, and that helped provide a buffer to discredit the TV ads because you had TV anchors who were saying these ads are false. So I think there is still, the gate is swung open, but there is still a traditional media gatekeeper function that is playing, and you need to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think one of the things I saw that was very different when I came back after a number of years was that it's not a slam dunk that candidates do all the ed boards or that they do talk to all these papers. Because depending on who your candidate is and who you're targeting, if you're targeting younger voters, I don't know that they care what an editorial says. But again, you can use it in an ad, and that is a great third-party validator. But I think that is where ed boards have kind of fallen in California now, is they're not must-dos anymore, and you can pick and choose more depending on who your candidate is. For our most recent campaign, he was much more authentic and better with TV and radio, and our message, I think, stuck better there, so that's where we focused our time and didn't spend all the time chasing these print stories, but spent our time on more TV and radio.
Oh yeah, in Florida, we did not do a single editorial board interview, primary or general. And I think Rick Scott in his campaign for breaking us of that tradition when he ran in 2010. Julian and Kurt are here somewhere. I've seen him earlier, but they made the decision not to do it, and it has kind of set a precedent in Florida. And I think you're seeing it around the country where these ed boards, getting endorsed by the local paper doesn't mean anything anymore. It's completely changed. It's you see no one. I have not. Really, not since I've been in this. I've not been in a focus group where someone said, "I'm voting for that person because the Tampa Bay Times endorsed them." That doesn't mean anything anymore. So you can skip past that because really, a lot of these guys are putting them on video now. They're taping the ed board interviews, and you just end up with so much opposition research from sitting down for 45 minutes with a bunch of liberal editorial boards.
There are some tough conservative ones too.
So it's interesting because also we're talking about the need to evolve the strategic thinking of the people who are on the front line dealing with the media and having to funnel that information back to your bigger headquarters while you're trying to get the message out. But Brad, why don't you talk to us about maybe generating earned media and sometimes the benefit that paid media can help in earned and how you cut through some of that clutter?
Yeah, I think we always believe, we say it's something else when we sign up with a campaign, is that we want to be there from the very beginning of the campaign. Because if you screw things up as a campaign from the day you launch to the day you go up on TV, it really doesn't matter how good the television ads are, because if the entire campaign has been messed up or had a different message from that moment forward, what we do on television doesn't matter, or it looks disjointed. It doesn't have the same effect. And so your earned media strategy has to play into whatever you're putting up on paid media, and that goes back to some of the simple blocking and tackling stuff. If you're going to put a message on TV this week about, education or the environment or whatever it is, you have to have an earned media strategy that's going to back that up. We think television is the most important medium, obviously, but we believe that your mail, your digital, your text messaging, what people are seeing, those are secondary advertising mediums, so they have to play into what you're doing on television. If they're seeing an ad for you, on ESPN where you're talking about the environment, and then they get a piece of mail from you that talks about education, it doesn't have the same effect as if they're seeing environment, they're getting a piece of mail on environment, and they're getting a piece of mail or a text message or a negative piece on the environment about your opponent. So, we think, we had a very simple message in the primary where it was Ron was a conservative, he was a veteran, and he was endorsed by Trump. And the president was very helpful in getting that message out for us, but we had to do a little work we had to do a little work. We famously cut an ad that showed Ron building a wall with his child. We thought it was very funny. I think Jared and some other Democrats didn't think it was as funny.
We thought it was funny too.
But we thought it was very effective.
But you guys had the last laugh.
Yeah, we did have the last laugh. And we thought, like if we know what our message is, we know what our 3 points are, that ad, reinforced those 3 messages. Nobody left that ad thinking that Ron wasn't endorsed by Trump and wasn't a conservative. And it helped us kind of overcome, an onslaught of negative media that was coming from our primary opponent.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because it's something that I thought about a lot when we were planning out how to do the Inslee launch is, this is such a diverse media environment. There's so many outlets out there, and how do you break through if you're presidential candidate number 12? And one of the things that we really aim for...
Don't sell yourself short.
I was saying the 12th to endorse. We'll be number 1 by the end. But I think one of the things that we tried to do was figure out, can we create a moment, and can that moment look different than everything else that people are absorbing? So we could have introduced Jay Inslee by talking about, well, he's a progressive champion, he's done all these progressive things, he was the first governor in the race, and we specifically chose, no, we're going to do it about climate change, we're going to pre-do some interviews so they're embargoed for 7 a.m. on a Friday morning, and we did a video that was produced by a guy who'd done music videos for Macklemore, and not by like a political consultant, although it was overseen by a political consultant. But one of the things we tried to do is have a different look to it and to bomb people with information, because that was the only way that you were going to break through with a new candidate, as opposed to just throwing out another name in the ether and having it disappear.
Well, I think the same thing happened recently on the Cox campaign here in California. John's message was very unique in that it focused on the affordability and the difficulty of living in California and the high cost of housing and the traffic and all sorts of different problems. So if you look, even though he clearly isn't governor, he outpolled most Republicans in California, if not all. I think Tim's here somewhere. I think everybody. We were points ahead of everybody else. And if you look now at Gavin Newsom's message as governor, he has the same message that John had during the campaign. So I think it's important when trying to break through the clutter that you have to have, you use polling. You have a message that resonates and sticks with people and works.
So you're using polling, you've got your message that you want to hone in on, but you've alluded to it, want to put your opponent on their heels, even as you yourself are moving your message forward.
Oh, I think, back to that ad, which obviously is infamous or famous, whichever way you look at it. I would tell you that it put Adam Putnam on his heels. We joked in the primary, like Adam Putnam had to answer for that ad wherever he went. Whether when he was going to like the local Republican club, these people had seen it on TV and were asking him about it. And he had no choice. He was stuck between a rock and a hard place because he can't criticize the president. He's having a hard time criticizing us for jokingly talking about how much Ron likes the president. I think it completely. I feel very strongly. We were trending in the right direction in that, but I think that ad kind of, it wrecked their campaign. He had no real answer to it. I don't know what I would have said if I was Adam Putnam.
So while we're talking about wrecking campaigns, let's talk about opposition research. And what is it that you can do to place some of your best opposition research items and morsels, and where do you decide to place them now, and has that shifted with the changing landscape?
I think it's changed a lot, and I think there's been a huge sea change since Trump became president, because you have Donald Trump with his boatloads of opposition research. It's very difficult to move something about some congressional vote that someone made. And you also have this there is no such thing as if you thought there was a kill shot in a campaign, like that should have happened to Donald Trump in 2016, and it didn't. So it is very, very difficult to have a kill shot like that. But I think you can sort of figure out creative ways to break things loose. One thing we did in one smaller state last year where you had a really small local press corps, there was a piece of oppo that we were trying to move. Every local press reporter ignored it. We thought it was pretty good and worth putting on TV. So we ended up going to a national outlet who wrote it. Within 12 hours, the Republican candidate was up holding a press conference defending himself on that issue, and all the local press wrote it because they took the cue from the national. So I think thinking about ways that you can drive that message, especially with the declining local press corps in a new media environment, is what I aim for.
Well, and to Brad's point earlier about just getting the other campaign off their game, we had a number of websites that focused on our opponents' Oppo research. And while sometimes those stories didn't get written, they still got asked about it, and they had to research it, and they had to spend time focusing and answering for that. So while the story wasn't out there, it did get the other campaign to use their resources focusing on our issues instead of theirs.
It's one more day you win.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always say, like, I would tell our researchers, nobody thinks your research is as good as you think it is. And I can't tell you how many times I've been on a campaign where like a researcher comes screaming in the room and think they have it. Like, this is it. The campaign is over. He's going to have to drop out. And you're like, yeah, it's pretty good. And you tell a reporter, and they're like, yeah, we're going to pass on that.
Right.
You know, so like every researcher thinks that they've found the silver bullet. I think it's getting harder and harder. I just think, you know, Trump has totally broken the system when it comes to opposition research, the way you place this stuff. But I mean, the thing about it is it's so much about how the candidate, you know, your opposition has to respond to it. And you were talking about the press conference. You know, if you look at what's happening, you know, we have totally forgotten about Virginia because we have moved on to 10, you know, different other things, major news stories since then. But I mean, the Virginia story was broken by, you know, a small blog, a small conservative blog, and they broke that story and it ballooned into national press. I think if you have a good piece of research, it doesn't really matter where you place it. It matters how they respond. And I would tell you that the governor in Virginia has responded very poorly. But he has been saved by the fact that the national press just moves so fast now that we have totally moved on from that. He just kind of weathered the storm. And I think that's, unfortunately, in the Trump era, that is probably going to be the rule and not the exception now, that you're going to have more not just candidates, but sitting elected officials who think like, well, I'll just wait this thing out. People are going to move on to the next thing. They've done it with Trump. They've done it in Virginia. I think you're going to see a lot more candidates. And I would advise, you know, there are a lot smarter people than me in this room, but I would advise my candidates and our clients, if something like this happens, you know, if it's not completely disqualifying, that you can move on. Whereas 5 years ago, that was not the case. Yep. You had to resign as soon as something like that came out. And you're just seeing people who say, like, I'll just weather the storm. People have short attention spans. Trump's going to tweet something tomorrow that the press is going to pick up on, and like, we don't have to deal with this.
But I think you also see that these stories can take on a life of their own, and you just need to throw a lot out there and see what sticks. One example in Florida from the primary was there was a piece that came out about Adam Putnam and how much money he'd gotten from Publix. And we thought, yeah, it was a fine story that ran. We'll see what happens. And suddenly, organically online, all these activists connected that with the fact that he had called himself a proud NRA sellout. And within a week, there was a boycott Publix Twitter hashtag that was trending. There were die-ins in Publix right around the corner from Brad's house.
I couldn't even get a sub. Terrible.
And I think, like, you know, we didn't expect that would necessarily happen, but you sort of have to see where the sea is moving and then start paddling.
The conversation just made me think about an Arnold story, how little outlets can bring big news. So Governor Schwarzenegger had been in a motorcycle accident, and there was a little small radio station that called and asked if he had a motorcycle license. And I remember having to go into his office and because I knew better than to automatically answer, of course, so I went in and asked, and he said, no, I don't have a motorcycle license. So I'm like, all right, well, just be prepared for this to be big news. And the little radio station ran it, and suddenly, you know, the New York Times is calling us about the motorcycle license. So you never know what's going to drive major media.
Totally.
But as you're talking about this Publix and the generational shift that happened with suddenly something goes viral because, and it's activist driven. So you've got generational shifts on the outside that are driving news consumption, but you also have generational shifts in what's happening to staff. And anyone, as we know, the president, anyone can be their own media company, but so can the staff that you're hiring that are supposed to normally, under traditional norms, be subsumed under the brand of your candidate. But what happens when they feel they have a right to maintain that presence? So what are you doing as you create the teams that are going to be the ones that are engaging with the media?
I actually think that we have an opportunity with everything that's happened. Like, people will say there's more news than ever, there's more stuff to track than ever. I actually think we have an opportunity, and we employed this on our campaign, and we're employing it on other campaigns for our clients, is that, like, you have an opportunity where the communications department doesn't actually have to be as big as it used to be. You know, we ran a $16 million primary campaign with 10 media markets in one of the biggest states in the country, and we had one press staffer. We had one press staffer. And I, you know, as the campaign manager, I basically was the communications director as well, because we had the decision that we We needed to keep overhead as low as possible because we were running against a candidate who was going to have way more money than we were. You don't have to, if you can accept the fact that the old ways of doing things are dying, they don't have as much effect, you don't have to respond to every story, you don't have to waste your candidate's time with getting statements done for, for in-depth policy interviews and that stuff. If you just accept that those ways are dying, I think we have an opportunity where we can save money and not need these giant communication staff. I mean, I joked about it earlier, but you don't have to have an intern come in and clip stories anymore. Like, that stuff is all automated now. Google Alerts takes away an entire job on a campaign of having to do that. So I think we have an opportunity from a staff side to actually shrink the communications departments on these campaigns instead of expanding them because you believe, oh, we have to respond to every story, or we need someone monitoring Twitter to see what, Susie in Iowa is saying about Jay Inslee. I just think you can just
I've
move
got
past
that guy.
Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in California, for our huge, state, and we ran a very small, very nimble campaign. We had a full-time communications director, and I was an advisor, and that was it. So
We eventually hired a communications director.
yeah, we had a great communications director, Matt Shoup, for those that know him. He was phenomenal, but you don't need these huge staffs and people scouring papers and doing things. You're able to stay more focused and more disciplined in your message. The fewer people you have, and you're able to pivot when you need to and be more nimble and keep things where they need to be. So I totally agree with you that was a big change I saw, was the staff size just shrinking, because with online, digital, Facebook, Twitter, everything, you don't need these huge staffs anymore.
I found at the DGA we had some staffers who were in their early 20s and had grown up in this. We tweet everything, we share our feelings and our opinions, and initially I was sort of surprised by that, and I wanted to tell them to stop. But ultimately, I found it to be a real benefit because they were tweeting things about news stories. I realized there was no way to control the dam, and it was better to try to, you couldn't keep the dam in place. You had to control where it flowed. And what we did was, we let them tweet things, and oftentimes I would retweet them. And if they went over the line, I would sort of engage with them. But it was very rare that happened. And ultimately, it added good perspective. And I think kept the information flow in our organization because everyone was living on Twitter.
And I mean, you have to set ground rules, especially with younger staffers. I've found about when we hired all of our field staff. I mean, we went from a campaign of 5 people to a campaign of 50 people in 2 weeks, and we had a rule. I can remember, I did a conference call with all the.
That
field
happened
staff.
on the Gillum side too.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, we were both in the same boat. But we had a call with our entire staff where I said, by working for this campaign, you have given up your right to social media. You do not post anything on Facebook, you don't tweet anything, your Instagram, nothing is posted for the next 2 months unless it comes directly from the campaign and you're retweeting it or reposting it. And I said, by working for this campaign, you have given up your right. And I said, you get one warning. If I get called because Jared Leopold found some tweet that you did, because we were in a very sensitive race. We were running against an African-American candidate. Our candidate had said something the day after the primary that had brought all of this to the forefront. So we laid the groundwork very early.
I wasn't going to bring that up.
And we eventually had to let some staffers go, because they were commenting on stuff and it wasn't really inappropriate. It's not the right word, but we had set a tone that you're not going to do this. I mean, I have a rule. We were joking about it before we came out here. I have an app that automatically deletes all of my tweets that are older than a year old. And I do not want Jared going through my Twitter feed for my next client and finding a tweet that I had from high school, because we've had very bad experiences with that on the DeSantis campaign. We were attacking Andrew Gillum for his stance of signing the Dream Defenders Pledge, which was very anti-cop, and it was a message that was working, but I don't know if it was the DGA or someone found a tweet from our scheduler who when she was 16 years old, she had got pulled over by a cop and she had tweeted out "F the police." And she is a very lovely, professional woman now who has grown out of that. But the tweet was, 8 years old, when she was 16 years old, and they found it. So all of a sudden, we're having to respond for the fact that we're pushing this incredible message that's really working, and then all of a sudden, we're getting asked about, we have a staffer who tweeted out "F the police." And so that took us off our game for a day. That was when I found Tweet Delete, which is a great website. and I would advise everybody to use that.
All right, so we wanted to open it up to any questions that the group might have. If you want to stand up and yell an inappropriate question or interrupt anyone, feel free. We're used to it up
That's
here.
a dangerous thing.
Bring it on.
That's a dangerous thing.
Hey guys, thanks so much. Just would like to hear your thoughts on how you think podcasting will affect 2020. I'm not going to go spend 2 hours watching Andrew Yang do a CNN town hall, but I spent 2 hours listening to him talk to Joe Rogan easily.
I mean, I think it's huge because it narrowcasts to a specific set of people. And one of the things that, I mean, there's a lot of weird things about what Andrew Yang is doing, but one of the things that I think is smart about it is that he is building odd constituencies of people who just sit on the internet waiting for someone to talk to them. And you know, podcasts are a place to find that. And it's also a way to, you know, it's a way to drive news now. If you say something newsworthy on Pod Save America, there are a lot more Democrats who are going to hear that than if you go on, you know, CNN at 2 p.m. So I think it has to be a part of the schedule. It's something that we're building in Inslee World as we're planning these things out. And I think it's an opportunity for people to think about how to connect with those people who are not dialed into politics every day, but have an interest in politics or policies.
I have nothing to add. That was a very good answer.
Agreed.
Any other questions? Well, while people are maybe thinking about questions, we know that everyone tries to be planful, but there's also times when things don't go right, and often those are when we learn the best lessons. So if any one of you would maybe want to answer something that maybe hasn't gone quite according to plan and what you learned from it.
I will not reference Florida in any of this.
Where's the fun in that?
I have no comment on that. One thing that I think there's always a question of when you want to engage and when you don't want to engage. And we had a story during the DNC hacking story. The New York Times thought that the DGA had been hacked, although it was actually a vendor that we used that had been hacked and our stuff was totally untouched. This happened to occur 3 days after my son was born. So I got an email about it, and I sort of ran it by people and like, oh, let's not engage with this. And I was working off 1 hour sleep and changing my first 40 diapers of my life, so I had no idea. But then the story broke and inaccurately said that the DGA had been hacked, and it created a whole huge news storm because we hadn't gotten in and corrected it in the first place. So I think one of the things that I've learned, and I saw it actually this cycle, even with right-wing news outlets that are breaking stories like the Washington Free Beacon, sometimes there's a value to engaging with them. I normally say don't negotiate with terrorists, but in that case, there are times when it's worth engaging with them if you can clearly set a fact out there that helps ameliorate the story.
I mean, along those lines, I learned the hard way that I set the rule that no matter what reporter calls you, you call them back and make sure they have the right information. When I was
You are nicer than I am.
Yeah, I was a very young press staffer, new to campaigns a long time ago. I'm going to age myself here. And we got a call about a candidate, what was his stance on offshore oil drilling. And I was answering the phone and I'm a little eager, and I said, I don't know, I'll call you back. And our campaign manager back then said, don't call him back, we're not getting into that, we don't want to talk about it. Well, back before the internet, we get the paper the next day, big headline, top of the fold, that our candidate was unclear on his stance, and I'm hearing my name yelled down the hallway, and what did you do? And and this was before the internet, so you can't call and get a correction. It's top of the fold of a major daily. So, I learned back then, and I have a rule whenever I work on a campaign or for a client that no matter what reporter calls you, you call them back, even if you're calling them back to tell them you're not going to talk to them. Because you always want to make sure that you follow up and don't let those things fall because it'll end up on the front page.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we had a very, I'm going to reference the one everyone thinks I'm going to reference. We made what we would admit is a mistake the day after the primary when our candidate went on national television and used a term he probably shouldn't have used. We knew internally, Ron's feelings. Ron was actually the first person, I can say, on primary night, Whit was there, we were kind of slapping each other on the back, like, oh, we're so glad we got Andrew Gillum. If it was Gwen Graham, we would have had, it would have been a much tougher race, Andrew Gillum, blah, blah, blah. And Ron kind of
We
stopped
said the
everyone.
same thing about Ron DeSantis.
I know.
We were wrong.
Yeah, I know. We both got the candidates that we wanted. And Ron was the first person to say, like, I think running against Andrew Gillum was going to be very difficult. Andrew Gillum's a very talented politician, and so we kind of walked into it the day after the primary. And so the lesson I would say that we learned, and I give Ron a lot of credit for this, is Ron was very quick to say, like, if we apologize for this, we'll be apologizing for things the entire campaign. Was it indelicate? Yes. Was it what it's being made out to be? No. And Ron laid the groundwork to say we're not going to apologize. And the lesson that I learned from this is that the news media moves fast. We dealt with that story for a week solid, and we dealt with the ramifications of it for probably a month. But by the time the election came around, it was not the overriding issue that we were concerned about. We started to see it fall off in the verbatims after a month. I think the lesson, had we done what we're seeing them do in Virginia, and we would have overreacted and had some press conference where we made another gaffe because it's such a delicate issue, we would have been dealing for that longer, and it may have ultimately cost us the election. So I think the lesson I learned in that is what we're talking about. In the Trump era, the news moves so fast, and we spend too much time thinking about how I'm going to respond to this and over responding, then you end up creating more harm than good.
So as we start to wrap up the panel, building off of that, Sarah, why don't we start with you? What would be a lesson that you think, or a nugget about the new media environment that would be good for people to take away?
I think one thing that I've really learned, especially in the new media, and we touched on this earlier, was you can pick and choose your interviews, your sources, where you go now. You don't have to respond to every call. You have to call them back. I learned that the hard way, but you don't have to engage in every single opportunity, and you can be more focused and disciplined. And our campaign managers for Cox, Wayne Johnson, and Tim Rosales, they were very, very focused and disciplined. And within the first couple of weeks, we would get these calls from these major publications and that would want to engage on issues which were not our message. And I would kind of was still back in the mindset like, well, but this is this reporter, you've got to call him back. It's the LA Times, the New York Times. So I would call them back and say, we're not commenting on that story because it wasn't our message. And they were so disciplined on message and outlet that I think that's where most of John's traction was gained, was just the maintaining the discipline on message and outlet throughout the campaign.
I think one of the things that I've seen is that there's so much noise in the media environment that you need to find your moments to break through. And I think Brad's team did it really well with their ad in the primary. I think Ralph Northam, and to say a positive thing about him, in 2017 he did it really well in his primary where he called Trump a maniac, and people remembered that. I think the best example from 2018 perhaps was Gretchen Whitmer, who ran ads saying fix the damn roads. And I think you just need these key moments where you're standing out from the pack and saying things that people didn't expect you to say, like having a kid build a wall, or having someone, a gubernatorial candidate, say fix the damn roads, was something that popped out and made people pay attention. You need to find those moments where people can pay attention, whether it's paid or earned.
Yeah, and I would say both of those are very good. You stole both of mine. But I would say, like, especially with this cycle being that we're going to be dealing with a presidential reelect. Last cycle we saw it, we were able to capitalize on it, but Trump is just going to override everything, and that's not just national news. That's leaking into local. It's leaking into state. I mean, I know the AP in Florida. They essentially told me when we would pitch them stories, they would say, the AP used to be the harbinger. If you could get a story in the AP, that was all that mattered in Florida because it would get picked up. The AP now will not write a story in Florida unless it has a national contingent to it. It'll be Florida-based, but it has to have a national tie-in, or it can't get past their editors. They don't want to write stories. They don't want to write stories that have to do with the state capitol anymore. They know that the local papers aren't getting it because people aren't reading it. They want to read stories about Trump. They want to read stories about national news because it's what they're watching on cable news, and they're so much more dialed into that than they are into the local stuff. So to your point, I think the candidates that are going to be successful, not just on congressional race level, Senate race level, even in the local race level, is you have to have some kind of national tie-in to your story because it's what people are ingesting. And I think we saw it in our race. There were Democrats on the primary race against us who were running, who had spent I forget what the Miami Beach mayor spent, but $30 million or something on television, way more than anybody else. But he didn't figure out until a month out that he should be spending his ads attacking Donald Trump, which is what Andrew Gillum did the entire race, and people were responding to that. We were doing it on our side, obviously trying to show that we supported the president, but the Democrats who are going to be successful are the ones who stand up to the president, and I think we're seeing it on the presidential side with their primary. It looks like the Democrat primary voters are going to want whoever's going to stand up to Trump, and they want that, going down the ballot. It's not just going to stop at the presidential level. So I would my advice would be, if you're on the Democrat side, tell your candidates to go out and spend their time attacking the president, and if you're on the Republican side, do the opposite, because that's what primary voters want.
What's interesting about that is that one of the things we didn't talk about today is that there's a tethered version of going all national, alluding to us. The tethered version of the national is actually the decline in the local news media. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you don't have anyone that's really digging deep and making it granular and making it so personal into the districts. And I think that you're seeing people feel disconnected even from the media coverage they're having, which is then pushing them into some of the newer outlets. And I saw a poll that showed that people who didn't have good local news coverage were actually more likely to support President Trump. So there's ramifications to the shifting news environment driven by financial issues.
Oh yeah, I've been in California now for a week, and I can't tell you if I've seen an LA Times paper anywhere, but every coffee shop I go into has the New York Times. Every single coffee shop has a New York Times copy in it, and I have not seen a lot of Wall Street journals anywhere, but they have plenty of New York Times. So all that is driven by cable news television has completely changed the game. The internet changed it again, and now you're just seeing people they're not reading the local paper anymore. They're getting the Wall Street Journal. They're getting the New York Times. Those are the articles they're reading because they don't have to sit and wait for a newspaper to get delivered every day. They can go on the website and find it as easily on the New York Times as they can for their local paper.
And people are really picking the news outlets that meet them instead of having broad-based news to meet everyone. So you have Democrats are reading Huffington Post or MSNBC, and Republicans are, reading the Washington Free Beacon and watching Fox News, and you sort of have these two parallel
Those terrorists
universes.
at the Washington Free Beacon.
I'm really expecting them to write a story about me saying that, actually.
All right, well, thank you.